Hi, it's Mrs. Sewell, and I'm going to do a video for you on classical conditioning today. This is something that you can use if you've forgotten about classical conditioning over the Thanksgiving break. And then I had a few students who were out when I did this lecture on classical conditioning, so I wanted to make sure that you had it as well. So let's take a look, all right? A classical conditioning is a type of associative learning. Most of the way we learn is through associative learning, and that's just learning that two things or two events come together. They occur together. So we associate one event with another event. So let me give you an example. I have two dogs at home, and whenever I put my tennis shoes on, they go nuts. They're so excited. They run to their leashes. My older dog starts stretching out because they've learned to associate the sight of me in tennis shoes with going for a walk. I don't really wear tennis shoes around the house. I rarely wear them. I usually wear sandals or flip-flops. So they know if I have tennis shoes on, they're going for a walk. And so that is an association they make. Mr. Sewell in tennis shoes equals a walk, all right? So classical conditioning is a type of associative learning. This one is involuntary. So we're always going to be looking at involuntary responses, drooling, temperature changes like you're too hot, anxiety, fear, happiness, something that's involuntary. It's not anybody or anything making a choice. The reaction is an involuntary reaction. So let's take a look. This Nearpod is really good. There's a self-guided link or self-paced link on your November 17th agenda. I really recommend that you go in and work through. I'm going to give you the notes, but go in and watch the videos because they're super helpful. This is a funny video from The Office. You definitely want to watch that. That's fun. He's showing a type of associative learning there. All right, so we're going to start with Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov is probably one of the most famous people in psychology. He's considered to be the father of classical conditioning, but he really wasn't actually a psychologist. He was a physiologist who was studying dogs. And in a study of dogs, he was studying their digestion and their salivation. He'd end up winning a Nobel Prize for his study, but he really makes a discovery that's important in psychology. What he had done, and you can watch it, there's a couple of videos, again, they are worth watching. They're going to show you exactly what he did, but I'll describe it for you. And this is a very famous experiment. So what he did was they hooked up tubes to the outside of the dog and rerouted their salivation into tubes. They wanted to measure how much the dogs were salivating. And so they took measurements each day. They would feed the dogs and they wanted to see how much they salivated while they digested. While he's doing this, he discovers that the dogs start salivating before they actually give them food. And he realizes that they're salivating to the sound of the footsteps or the sound of the door or the appearance of the researcher. So he starts to do a different kind of study, and he discovers that the dogs start to make associations between the sound of those footsteps and the fact that the food is coming. So he tries ringing a bell before he feeds the dogs. And pretty soon, the dogs, when they hear the bell, will start to drool. And so then he subs it out. He turns on a light right before he feeds them. And the light is enough to start making, after a few trials, to make the dogs drool. And so this is how he discovers classical conditioning. The most famous example is the food with the bell, but he also uses metronomes, he uses music boxes, he uses lights, all kinds of stimuli, and the dogs begin to associate those different stimuli with the fact that food is coming, and they start to drool. And so let's talk about classical conditioning. With classical conditioning, by the way, is just learning. If you in your mind can substitute learning for conditioning, so if you look at this slide, before conditioning occurs, before learning occurs, what happens? Okay, in the classical conditioning, you got to know what the UCS and UCR are: the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditional response. They will use the words, or they'll sometimes use the abbreviation. And so as we practice with it, you want to be able to use the abbreviations. It makes your life a little bit easier too, and you want to know what they stand for. So an unconditioned stimulus is something that's naturally going to trigger a response. In Pavlov's experiment, it's the food. The food will naturally make the dog drool. Dogs will drool for for food. They have a salivation reflex, Pavlov would discover, okay? And then they have an unconditional response, the UCR, and that's an unlearned, naturally occurring response to the UCS. So when presented with food, a dog will salivate. They didn't learn it, it happens. It's a natural reaction. And so that's what we're looking for at classical conditioning is a UCS, an unconditioned stimulus that will automatically trigger the unconditional response. The dog did not have to learn to salivate at the sight of food, okay? It's automatic, okay? And so that's what we're talking about. It's involuntary and automatic, all right? Now, with Pavlov, then he wants to condition the dog. He wants to train the dog. The dog's learning. And so as he does that, he has to find a neutral stimulus, something that wouldn't ordinarily make the dog drool. So ringing the bell, right? Or, playing the music box, turning on a light. Those things in and of themselves would not make a dog drool. So they're neutral, all right? So the neutral stimulus doesn't render a response when the dog sees it, all right? And so that has to be presented. The neutral stimulus has to be presented right before the unconditioned stimulus, the UCS. And to condition the dog in this case, you do that over and over. You ring the bell and give the dog the food. Ring the bell, give the dog the food. Ring the bell, give the dog the food. It's important that the bell comes first so that they're learning to associate that sound with the presentation of food. And so during this phase, the dog is being conditioned to know that food is coming. Pretty soon he'll develop an association between the bell and the food. Then when that happens, when the association is established, so conditioning is complete, that bell becomes the conditioned stimulus, all right? Before it wouldn't make the dog do anything. Once the dog is conditioned, that originally irrelevant stimulus, which has been associated with the UCS, the unconditioned stimulus, the food, starts to trigger the same response. And so the conditioned stimulus, it's the same neutral stimulus that you were using during conditioning, okay, will now trigger a conditioned response, all right? So the sound of the bell is going to trigger a response. Your conditioned response is because remember, conditioning is learning, is the learned response to that bell, that originally neutral stimulus. So now the dog has made the association that the bell means food. So the bell is the conditioned stimulus. It was the neutral. Now it's conditioned once the training is complete. And the conditioned response is the drool. Now the dog is drooling to the sound of the bell. No food required anymore. And so he has learned the association to the food. And so he drools, okay? That's his conditioned response. He drools to the sound of the bell. So that's really the essence of classical conditioning. Here's another example. It's the same example. Here they're using a tuning fork, but it just walks you through. The UCS is the food, the unconditioned stimulus. The UCR is the salivation or the drool. The tuning fork here is the neutral stimulus. When you wave a tuning fork before conditioning, then the dog's not going to do anything. He's going to be like, what's that? All right. Then you start to condition the dog. You wave the tuning fork, it'll make a sound and present the food. And then the dog will salivate for the food, right? And you do this over and over. Once the dog is conditioned, all you have to do is wave the tuning fork. Now it's the conditioned stimulus. You wave the tuning fork and the dog will drool. He'll make a conditioned response, a learned response to the tuning fork. Okay, so before, the drooling was an unconditioned response. He's going to automatically drool for food. But once he's been conditioned, he's learned that the tuning fork means food. So he will drool just for the tuning fork with no food present. Here's another video. You can't see it on my screen because I'm a teacher, but I still don't have YouTube. So again, watch these videos. They'll walk you through it and it will really help you. This last one is Little Albert. You got to know about Little Albert. Again, hopefully you'll watch the video. I'm not going to present it here. I don't think there's sound on it, but Watson, we've talked about before. He's a very famous psychologist. He's a behaviorist. He trains little Albert to be afraid of basically furry animals. And so if you watch this video, you'll see he put Albert through a conditioning process. First, he checked to see if Albert had any fears. He wasn't naturally afraid of any kind of animal. He was kind of curious with them. But one thing he was afraid of was the banging of, a pipe on metal. And so the clanging sound frightened him and would make him cry. So Watson then decided he was going to condition little Albert to be afraid of animals. And so he would present little Albert with a white rat, and he would give him the rat, and then he'd start banging on that pipe, making that clanging sound. And that would make little Albert cry. And so he conditioned little Albert, give him the mouse, bang on the pipe. And ultimately, little Albert was conditioned to be afraid of the bunny. He didn't have to, or not the bunny, the rat in that case. Later, he'd use all kinds of other furry animals. He'd put on a bunny face mask so that he conditioned little Albert to be afraid of anything furry. And so this is, kind of the essence of behaviorism. So in this example, you've got to identify the neutral stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus, and the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response. It's really important that you work through this. So if you are just listening to me, but you haven't watched the video, go watch the video and work through it. Because by working through it, you'll figure it out. And then you can listen to me talk about the answers. But if you just listen to me, you won't get it. So in the little Albert experiment, the neutral stimulus is the white rat at the beginning and any furry animal later. The unconditioned stimulus, the one that will bring a natural reaction, is the banging of the pipe, the banging or clanging of the metal. The conditioned stimulus will be the same as the neutral stimulus. So the neutral stimulus is the white bunny, but Watson is trying to bring an association that the white bunny makes Albert fearful. And so the conditioned response is going to be fear. As you break these down, if you write it out, you're going to see the conditioned response and the unconditioned response. They're both fear. Okay. The banging sound made little Albert fearful. Okay. So the banging sound is the UCS and the fear is the UCR. But then he trained Albert to be afraid of a neutral stimulus. He conditioned him so to be afraid of a white bunny. The white bunny, the neutral stimulus, becomes the conditioned stimulus. When little Albert sees the white bunny or anything furry or white, then he becomes afraid. So the neutral stimulus and the conditioned stimulus are going to be the same thing. It's neutral when it doesn't cause a response. It's conditioned when it does cause the response, okay? So it's neutral as long as you're training and Albert's not reacting just to the rabbit, okay? He's acting to the rabbit with the noise, or the rat. He did both, all right? And so it becomes conditioned once he'll just cry because he's presented with the rat, right? Then it's a conditioned stimulus, and the fear is a conditioned response. Hopefully that made that clear. Okay, you have a packet here on November 17 agenda. That's when we started. I think it's on November 17th and November 18th agendas that we worked on classical conditioning. So be sure and go in and do the practice problems, because you have to work through those practice problems in order to understand this. And you may do them and still not understand them. Then email me and I will help you with it. Okay, so we're not going to worry about your feelings right now. So I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings that. All right, there are 5 vocabulary terms that go with classical conditioning. They'll also go with operant conditioning. And so I'm at 14 minutes. So I'm going to stop here. I'll do a second video, quick video, to go through these terms so that you understand what they mean. I was hoping to get it all done in 15 minutes, all right? But be sure and go look at the Nearpod on the early half. This second half, you won't need to.